The morning mist hung over Florence as Lorenzo de' Medici walked through the corridors of his palazzo, his footsteps echoing against marble floors that had witnessed centuries of political maneuvering. In his hands, he carried a manuscript that would change how power was understood forever, Niccolò Machiavelli's The Prince. What Lorenzo didn't yet realize was that within those pages lay not just instructions for ruling, but a blueprint for remaining untouchable, in a world where everyone sought to bring down those who rose too high. Machiavelli understood something fundamental about human nature that most political theorists of his time missed entirely. Power, he recognized, was not simply about commanding armies or accumulating wealth. True power lay in the ability to remain beyond the reach of those who would destroy you, to operate in a space where your enemies could not effectively strike, where your position was so carefully constructed that any attack would ultimately strengthen rather than weaken your position. The concept of staying beyond reach, as Machiavelli conceived it, was far more sophisticated than mere physical protection or political immunity. It represented a comprehensive strategy of positioning oneself in such a way that destruction became practically impossible, but because of careful orchestration of dependencies, loyalties, and strategic advantages, that made one's removal more costly than beneficial to potential enemies. In the turbulent city-states of Renaissance Italy, Machiavelli observed princes who rose and fell with stunning regularity. Some were overthrown by foreign invaders, others by domestic conspiracies, and still others by the simple erosion of their power base over time. But a select few seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to survive every storm, to emerge from crises not just intact but often stronger than before. These were the leaders who had mastered the art of staying beyond reach. The foundation of this strategy began with what Machiavelli termed the architecture of indispensability. Unlike rulers who relied purely on fear or affection from their subjects, those who achieved true security understood that they needed to make themselves essential to the functioning of their domain. This meant inserting themselves into the critical pathways of commerce, justice, and social order in such a way that their removal would cause more disruption than their continuation in power. Consider the case of Cesare Borgia, whom Machiavelli studied extensively. Borgia's genius lay not in his military prowess or his father's papal connections, but in his systematic approach to making himself irreplaceable within the regions he conquered. Rather than ruling through fear alone, he established new systems of law and order that actually benefited the local populations while simultaneously creating structures that could only function under his direct oversight. When his enemies plotted against him, they found that removing Borgia would mean dismantling the very systems that had brought prosperity and stability to their own territories. The second pillar of Machiavellian unreachability involved what he called the cultivation of necessary enemies. This counterintuitive principle recognized that having the right enemies was often more valuable than having the right friends. A leader who positioned themselves as the primary obstacle to genuinely threatening forces, whether foreign invaders, anarchists, or economic predators, could count on support from those who benefited from their protection, even if those supporters had no personal affection for the leader. This strategy required careful selection and management of opposition. The most effective practitioners would identify forces that posed legitimate threats to the broader community and then position themselves as the indispensable barrier against those threats. This created a situation where removing the leader would directly expose the population to dangers they feared more than they resented the leader's authority. Machiavelli observed this dynamic in the Italian city-states, where successful rulers often allowed certain external threats to persist at manageable levels, using them as justification for their own authority while ensuring that they remained the primary defense against those threats. The key was maintaining the balance. The threats had to be real enough to generate genuine concern, but controlled enough that they didn't actually overwhelm the leader's ability to manage them. The third element of staying beyond reach involved the strategic deployment of what Machiavelli termed distributed loyalty. Rather than attempting to win the complete devotion of any single group, master practitioners of this art spread their support base across multiple, sometimes competing factions. This approach meant that no single group could withdraw their support without being vulnerable to reprisals from other groups that remained loyal. This distribution of loyalty required extraordinary political skill. It meant understanding the complex web of relationships between different social, economic, and political factions, and positioning oneself as a valuable ally to each without becoming entirely dependent on any. A merchant class might support a ruler because of favorable trade policies, while the military supported them because of reliable payment and equipment. Religious authorities might find their interests aligned because of protection for church lands, while common citizens remained content due to effective law enforcement. The genius of this approach was that it created a situation where any conspiracy against the ruler would require coordination between groups that had fundamental disagreements with each other. Even if some factions became dissatisfied, the others would have strong incentives to defend the existing arrangement rather than risk the chaos that would follow the ruler's removal. As the sun climbed higher over Florence, casting sharp shadows through the palazzo windows, the implications of Machiavelli's insights began to crystallize in Lorenzo's mind. The manuscript revealed that the most secure form of power was not that which could not be challenged, but that which made successful challenges impossibly complicated to execute. The fourth principle Machiavelli identified was the management of information asymmetry. Those who stayed beyond reach understood that knowledge was power, but more importantly, they understood that controlling the distribution of knowledge was the ultimate form of power. This didn't simply mean keeping secrets, though that was certainly part of it. More sophisticatedly, it meant ensuring that different groups had access to different pieces of information, creating a situation where no single faction could develop a complete picture of the ruler's vulnerabilities or the full extent of their resources. Effective practitioners of this strategy would carefully control what information reached which audiences. Military commanders might know about troop strengths and deployments, but remain ignorant of financial arrangements. Economic advisors might understand trade relationships and monetary policy, but know nothing about intelligence operations. Religious leaders might be informed about diplomatic negotiations with other states, but kept unaware of domestic security measures. This compartmentalization served multiple purposes. It prevented any single individual or group from accumulating enough knowledge to pose a comprehensive threat. It also allowed the ruler to present different faces to different constituencies, emphasizing aspects of their governance that each group found most appealing while downplaying elements that might cause concern. Perhaps most importantly, information asymmetry created dependencies that reinforced the ruler's central position. When each faction possessed only partial knowledge, they became reliant on the ruler as the sole source of complete information. This made the ruler not just powerful but necessary. Removing them would leave everyone operating with incomplete intelligence about the true state of affairs. The fifth element of Machiavellian unreachability involved what he called strategic unpredictability within consistent frameworks. This concept balanced the need for reliability, which built trust and cooperation, with the advantages of keeping potential enemies unable to predict specific actions. The framework provided consistency that allies could depend on, while the unpredictability within that framework made it nearly impossible for enemies to plan effective strikes. This approach required establishing clear, consistent principles that governed decision-making while maintaining flexibility in how those principles were applied. A ruler might consistently prioritize the economic prosperity of their territory while varying dramatically in the specific policies used to achieve that prosperity. Allies could count on the commitment to prosperity, but enemies couldn't predict whether that would lead to new trade agreements, military protection for merchant routes, or investment in infrastructure. The unpredictability served as a defensive mechanism. Conspirators found it difficult to anticipate how a ruler would respond to specific provocations or opportunities. Plans based on expected reactions became unreliable when the ruler's specific responses couldn't be accurately predicted. Even when their general principles remained consistent, Machiavelli noted that this balance was extremely difficult to achieve. Too much consistency made rulers predictable and vulnerable. Too much unpredictability made them unreliable and cost them the trust necessary for effective governance. The most successful practitioners developed an almost artistic sense for when to surprise and when to conform to expectations. The afternoon light streaming through the palazzo windows illuminated dust motes that danced like the political particles Machiavelli described in his treatise Constantly in Motion, responding to invisible forces, creating patterns that appeared random but followed deeper laws of power and influence. Lorenzo began to understand that staying beyond reach required mastering these invisible forces rather than simply accumulating visible symbols of authority. The sixth principle involved the cultivation of what Machiavelli termed layered legitimacy. Rather than relying on a single source of authority, whether divine right, popular support, military strength, or economic power, those who achieved true security built multiple overlapping foundations for their rule. This created redundancy that protected against the failure of any single source of legitimacy. A truly secure ruler might simultaneously maintain traditional claims based on hereditary succession, popular legitimacy through effective governance, religious sanction through support from spiritual authorities, military legitimacy through successful defense of the territory, and economic legitimacy through prosperity and fair trade practices. If any one of these foundations was challenged or undermined, the others would provide sufficient support to maintain authority. This approach required careful balance and constant attention. Different sources of legitimacy could sometimes conflict with each other. Religious authorities might demand policies that hurt economic growth. Military necessities might require actions that reduced popular support. Hereditary traditions might conflict with effective governance practices. Navigating these tensions required extraordinary political skill and a deep understanding of how different constituencies valued different sources of authority. The layered approach also provided strategic advantages in conflicts. Enemies who attacked one source of legitimacy often found that they had actually strengthened the others. A ruler who was criticized for economic policies could point to their military successes and religious piety. One who faced challenges to their hereditary claims could demonstrate their popular support and effective governance. The seventh element of staying beyond reach involved what Machiavelli described as the cultivation of beneficial dependencies. This went beyond simply making oneself indispensable. It involved creating situations where other powerful actors became stronger because of their relationship with the ruler, creating incentives for them to actively defend and support the ruler's position. This strategy recognized that the most reliable allies were not those who owed favors or felt gratitude, but those who benefited concretely and continuously from the existing arrangement. A ruler who enabled merchants to access new markets created allies who had ongoing economic incentives to maintain the relationship. Military commanders who received resources and support that enhanced their own reputations had strong reasons to protect their benefactor. The key was ensuring that these beneficial dependencies were mutual and sustainable. One-sided relationships created resentment and instability. Unsustainable arrangements led to inevitable conflicts when resources became scarce. The most effective practitioners created webs of mutually beneficial relationships that grew stronger over time as each party's investment in the arrangement increased. This approach required genuine value creation rather than simple redistribution. Rather than taking from one group to benefit another, successful rulers found ways to expand overall prosperity, power, or security so that multiple groups could benefit simultaneously without feeling that their gains came at each other's expense. As evening approached and shadows lengthened across the marble floors, Lorenzo began to perceive the deeper architecture of power that Machiavelli had revealed. The manuscript described not just techniques for political survival, but a comprehensive philosophy of positioning oneself beyond the reach of destruction through the careful orchestration of human motivations and social dynamics. The eighth principle involved the strategic use of what Machiavelli called controlled vulnerabilities. This counterintuitive concept recognized that appearing completely invulnerable could actually create dangers. When rulers seemed to have no weaknesses, potential allies might conclude that they didn't need support, while enemies might feel compelled to find or create vulnerabilities to exploit. Instead, the most secure rulers carefully displayed selected vulnerabilities that served strategic purposes. These apparent weaknesses encouraged allies to provide specific types of support while directing enemy attention toward challenges that the ruler was actually well prepared to handle. A ruler might appear vulnerable to economic pressure, while secretly maintaining substantial reserves, encouraging enemies to pursue ineffective economic strategies while allies rallied to provide financial support. The key was ensuring that these displayed vulnerabilities were carefully chosen and controlled. They had to be believable enough to influence behavior, but manageable enough that they didn't create genuine risks. This required deep understanding of how different audiences perceived and evaluated threats and opportunities. Controlled vulnerabilities also served as early warning systems. By monitoring who attempted to exploit apparent weaknesses, rulers could identify potential threats while they were still manageable. Enemies who revealed themselves through attacks on controlled vulnerabilities could be dealt with before they discovered or created more serious problems. The ninth element of Machiavellian unreachability involved what he termed the multiplication of decision points. Rather than centralizing all authority in themselves, the most secure rulers created complex decision-making processes that involved multiple parties. This approach distributed responsibility for unpopular decisions, while ensuring that popular successes could be attributed to the ruler's leadership. This strategy recognized that direct personal authority, while sometimes necessary, created direct personal responsibility for every decision and its consequences. By involving advisors, councils, and other authorities in decision-making processes, rulers could insulate themselves from the negative consequences of specific choices while maintaining credit for overall policy directions. The multiplication of decision points also made it much more difficult for enemies to predict or influence specific outcomes. When multiple parties were involved in reaching decisions, conspirators had to account for the motivations and relationships of all participants, making successful manipulation exponentially more complex. With implementation, required careful attention to the balance of influence within decision-making processes. The ruler needed to maintain sufficient control to ensure that important decisions aligned with their objectives, while allowing genuine input from others so that they would accept responsibility for outcomes. This often involved creating situations where other parties felt that they had meaningful influence over decisions that the ruler had already determined would serve their interests. The 10th and final principle that Machiavelli identified was perhaps the most sophisticated: the cultivation of replacement costs. This concept involved making the process of replacing the rulers so expensive and complicated that potential successors and their supporters would conclude that reform or negotiation was preferable to revolution. This strategy required building governance systems that were deeply integrated with the ruler's personal knowledge, relationships, and capabilities. Successors would face not just the challenge of removing the current ruler, but the much more daunting task of rebuilding systems and relationships from scratch while maintaining stability and prosperity. Effective practitioners embedded themselves so thoroughly in the essential functions of governance that their removal would require extensive reconstruction of administrative, diplomatic, and economic systems. They cultivated personal relationships with key figures that would be difficult for successors to replicate. They developed specialized knowledge about local conditions, foreign relationships, and potential threats that would take years for replacements to acquire. But cultivation of replacement costs also involves strategic investment in projects and relationships that would be disrupted by leadership changes. Long-term economic development initiatives, diplomatic negotiations, and military preparations created stakeholder groups with strong interests in continuity rather than change. As night fell over Florence and candles were lit throughout the palazzo, Lorenzo closed the manuscript and reflected on the profound implications of what he had read. Machiavelli had revealed that true security came not from strength alone, but from the creation of complex, interconnected systems that made destruction more costly than accommodation. The lessons extended far beyond the political realm. In any competitive environment, whether in commerce, scholarship, or social relationships, The principles of staying beyond reach offered guidance for creating sustainable positions that could weather challenges and threats. The key was understanding that security came not from avoiding all risks, but from managing them in ways that created more problems for attackers than defenders. The strategies Machiavelli described required patience, intelligence, and constant attention to the shifting dynamics of power and influence. They demanded genuine skill in understanding human motivations and social systems. Most importantly, they required the wisdom to recognize that true power came not from dominating others, but from making oneself essential to their success and well-being. In the flickering candlelight, Lorenzo began to understand that Machiavelli's greatest insight was recognizing that the most secure position was not at the top of a hierarchy, but at the center of a network, not as the strongest player in a zero-sum game, but as the facilitator who enabled positive sum outcomes for multiple parties. Those who mastered this approach didn't just survive the storms of political change. They became the stable centers around which those storms revolved, remaining untouched while directing the forces that shaped their world. The manuscript revealed that staying beyond reach was ultimately about understanding and working with the fundamental forces that drove human behavior and social organization. It required seeing beyond immediate conflicts to the deeper patterns of interest and motivation that determined long-term outcomes. Most importantly, it demanded the courage to pursue strategies that might seem counterintuitive in the short term but created unassailable positions over time. As Lorenzo prepared to retire for the evening, he understood that he held in his hands not just a guide to political survival, but a manual for navigating the complexities of power in any context. Machiavelli had shown that those who truly understood these principles could achieve something even more valuable than victory in any particular conflict. They could transcend the conflict entirely, operating in a realm where their security and success became inseparable from the security and success of the systems they helped to create and maintain. The lessons of staying beyond reach represented more than mere tactical advice. They constituted a fundamental reframing of what it meant to wield power effectively and sustainably. In revealing these principles, Machiavelli had provided not just insights into political strategy, but a deeper understanding of how to create lasting value and influence in a world where change was the only constant and adaptability was the ultimate virtue. The candles burned lower as Lorenzo contemplated the transformation in his understanding of power, authority, and security. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but armed with Machiavelli's insights into staying beyond reach, he felt prepared to navigate whatever storms might arise, confident in his ability to remain not just secure, but essential to the prosperity and stability of all those whose lives intersected with his own. In the end, Machiavelli's greatest contribution was not providing a formula for achieving power, but revealing the deeper principles that governed how power actually functioned in the real world. Understanding these principles allowed leaders to work with, rather than against, the fundamental forces that shaped human behavior and social organization. Those who mastered these lessons found that they could achieve their objectives not through force or manipulation, but through the creation of conditions where their success became inseparable from the success of others. The manuscript closed with a final observation that had profound implications for anyone seeking to understand the nature of lasting influence and security. Machiavelli noted that those who achieved true mastery of these principles often found that they no longer needed to actively defend their positions. Their positions had become self-defending through the web of interests and relationships they had carefully cultivated. This represented the ultimate achievement in the art of staying beyond reach, creating conditions where one's security and prosperity became automatic byproducts of systems that served the broader good while advancing personal objectives. As the last candle flickered and went out, Lorenzo understood that he had been given not just political wisdom, but insight into fundamental principles of human organization that would remain relevant regardless of how political systems evolved over time. The specific tactics might change with circumstances, but the underlying dynamics that Machiavelli had identified would continue to govern how individuals and groups created sustainable positions of influence and security in an uncertain world. How to stay beyond reach. Lessons from Machiavelli.